going to do a demonstration today about tea budding. It's probably the best way to change varieties when you have a fairly large vine, 4 or 5 years and older. If you get to much older than, say, 20, 25 years, you end up with a lot of wood problems in vines. So changing varieties then, most people just kind of pull out the vineyard and just replant entirely. There are lots of other types of grafting. There's a side whip graft, which you can do in the spring. There's a cleft graft or kind of a wedge chip graft that works really well early in the spring. And then there's chip budding, which you can do spring or fall. Here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, I've always preferred, if I chip bud, I like to do it in the spring, but I do it about this time of year, late spring, because our weather can be quite variable. And this is a little warm, but this is the kind of weather you want. You don't want it to be 40 degrees. You want it above 50 anyway, so that the callus can form and the buds can actually take. If it gets too hot, of course, you can get some dehydration. But as you'll see when we get out to these big vines, when you're tea budding, it could be 105, and those big vines, when you cut their heads off, they're pumping water like crazy, so they don't dehydrate. Tea budding I like because if the timing is right on it, it's foolproof. You get very good success. You can typically get above 90%. Usually you get much higher than 90%. Chip budding takes a lot more skill. You have to really match the cambium layer. The cambium layer divides the plant into xylem on the inside, which is the water conducting cells of the plant, and phloem on the outside, which basically does nutrients. It can go either way. Well, that cambium layer is the dividing line for those two organs in the vine, and there's a certain time of year when that starts to split, the cells divide, it differentiates in between those two organs. For tea budding, if you wait until that is actively dividing, then you have great success, because those little cambium cells will work off of the hormones that are in the cambium layer of the little chip that we're going to put into it. And the way you can tell that the cambium layer is dividing is if it slips, if it peels very easily from the xylem on the inside and the phloem on the outside, which is the bark. Temperature is everything for vines, and for budding you want to have nice even temperatures. Once you've placed it into the fresh cambium layer, it'll take the bud 2 weeks to a month to really catch in and callus up, and then it starts to push, and then it grows like crazy, because as you'll see, there's mature vines out there that we're cutting everything off of, so they have a mature root system that's mining the soil. It's trying to pump water up, and as soon as those buds take, then they've got that whole root system to work with, and they grow like crazy. You can get easily a half a crop off your vineyard the year following tea budding, and then you're up to a full crop in the second year. They call this tea budding because, as you'll see, you cut a tea into the old vine that you slip the bud into to stick it, and then you wrap it up with tape, and they call it a chip bud because you're cutting a chip out of the plant and sticking it in. So, and a cleft, you cut a cleft in, you know, it's not rocket science, right? They just peeled the rough bark. It doesn't have to be this pretty. You just want to get down to the fresh bark. Okay. And you'll see why, because you really bend it around. Vines grow with nodes, and this was a really vigorous vine when it came up. That's the internode right there. That's a 5-inch internode. That's pretty good. And what you want when you're putting in your buds is some nice straight grain. When you look at vines, they're never in a circle. They're always kind of a little bit like an oval. And so you want to go on one of the sides that has a bigger curve, because there's something with the physiology that the cambium layer, the bark is thicker there. And the thicker it is, the stronger it is. I probably put one in right here because it's nice and curved, and I probably put another one right here. By putting them there, then that automatically kind of lets them go either way. So the first thing you do after you cut the vine, you peel this off. What I like to do, because I don't like my hands always getting sticky and wet, is because that can be a little dangerous, is you go down and you cut the vine. And you go on either side. These are healthy vines. You want it to bleed down here. You don't want it to bleed up here. If you have any water, any of the sap on the bud, it won't callus up, and you lose your bud. And also, when you cut on either side, you make sure you don't cut in the same area. So you cut here, and then you cut a little higher or a little lower. Just cut till it stops bleeding, and you can tell when it stops. It starts to congeal already. And then what you always have to do is that you come back the next day in the morning, because that's when it pumps the most, and you check every single vine on top for any moisture, and also push on the bud when it's in. You push on the bud, and if you see if it's wet at all, you go back and you find your cut and you take a couple more strokes on it. And then another week you do the same thing. And in a couple weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, that will heal up. By that time, hopefully the bud has calloused in, and boom, everything takes off. With a chip bud, you put the bud in, say, here's the rootstock. You put your bud in here, and then right below it, you cut a little notch. And it bleeds down. Same concept. You don't want it to bleed. You don't want to collect fluid on that bud, because it retards callus formation. You're cutting through the phloem into the xylem so that it's bleeding down there. That'll heal itself, and no problem to the vine. I mean, you're already shocked at enough. You cut its head off. You know, it's. This bud is kind of programmed to be dormant. This was probably collected in January. December, January. If you put one of those buds that's already been dormant and it's already gone through a cold period, a long cold period, because it's been in the refrigerator for a while, as soon as it warms up and it gets calloused into the vine, it grows like crazy. These are specialty knives. They're just grafting knives. So the best way to practice is on something that's not quite so hard. So you can take a shoot, and so here's the bud, right? I took off the leaf. Same thing as on that other one. And you start in, I like to go about a finger's width, 3/4 of an inch below the bud, and then you just make a downward cut. You never just kind of chop. You want to slice through it. So again, you go about 3/4 of an inch down, you go about a 45-degree angle, and you cut through the wood. Then you start up above the bud, and again, trying to keep your wrist straight, then you just slice it through. And you end up with a goofy-looking cut that has a fairly long end to it with a little, a sharp little point. The bud's up here. You've cut through the node with the bud. You have the xylem underneath here. That little green line is the cambium layer. It's starting to bleed a little bit. And then you have the bark on top. Look at a cane, and then you look at the angle that the bud comes out of the cane.
Always goes up.
It always goes at a 45-degree angle, more or less. And yeah, it's like, you don't plant it. You always plant it with the bud pointing up. Have the bud pointing toward you. So you go about, I don't know, 3/4 of an inch, cut through it, then you come up like that and flip it up. So there's one. It goes in my mouth. The next one, you clean it up just a little bit, and you go 3/4 of an inch like that, and then catch it. The reason why they call this tea budding is because the cut that I make into this wood is in the shape of a T. So I'm going to do one on this side, because again, that's where it's got the biggest curve. And I'm going to go on the high side of the inner node, where I've got plenty of wood to work with. Where the first cut is straight down, and the next cut is across. It ends up being a little bit curved, and that's the T part. And then what I like to do is I will catch the edge on this side, on the side that I'm cutting through, catch it and flip it up so it opens it up. So again, I cut the T, and I open up here, and you open up there, and then there's the little chip, the bud, and you start it, and then you catch it and go about that far. All the different plant hormones are being produced by the tips of this shoot, and also some of the inner nodes, the laterals and the flowers. You've taken all that away. So the vine wants to, it's all about hormone balance, and so the only auxin that's produced right now is by these two little dormant buds. And so as soon as they wake up and start sending out their auxin, then the plant wants to heal that as quickly as it can to get to that auxin, and then it starts to grow. So again, you find a good spot, see how it's right on the nice edge, and you do a vertical cut, then you do your T. You can, okay, so, this is good. So look at this one isn't pulling. Go and try, everybody should try that. If it doesn't slip, you don't bud it. I'll try the other side. Sometimes there's a dead spot on the vine. These internodes are pretty close. So you go on the high side of the internode, cut across. So you go on the high side of it, so when you push the bud in, it's sitting right in the sweet spot. See how it's right in between?
In between the two internodes.
You're right.
Like
It's and it's flat against there. When you tape it, you'll flatten it out against there. So there's a node and there's a node. And see how it sits right in the flat spot in between. There's a bud node and there's a bud node. And right there that's the most important part, because that's where all the hormones from this bud are going to travel down, and that's where it's going to heal in. So if you try to fit that over a little knob like that, it's not going to stick on very well. If it's not sitting nice and tight up against there, and if it is a little bit loose, as long as you can tighten it up with the tape, you're okay. If you can't do that, then you should find another place in the vine to put your bud. So you've got your two buds, and then you have grafting tape. I'll either get it from Central Valley Builders Supply, or I'll get it from Vineyard Industry Products. No, it can't be sticky, and it's got to be fairly strong.
Seems like flagging tape.
Yeah, but it's similar, but it stretches more and it's stronger than flagging tape. So then you want to tie these up. You want to form the bark back around them to seal it off so that you keep some moisture in it. And also it helps with wind protection for when the vines start growing. So you just kind of wrap it up, and you want to do a crossover. The top is the most important, because that's where the most leverage comes across when these grow up and the wind starts whipping them. And then you see how I'm kind of making little X's around the buds. I was taught by Lloyd Leiter at UC Davis a long time ago. And he would always take one pass, so he'd do this, and then he'd take a pass over the buds, and then he'd cut a little X in the buds. I don't do that anymore. I used to, but that takes a lot of time. And I haven't seen any difference. It's either going to take or it isn't. And then you just flip it underneath, tug it tight. I've done as little as just two passes on either side. If it's a nice small vine, but I prefer, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4 wraps across on each side. So that's it. What I like to do, because I cane prune everything at Ridge, at Montebello. So what I will do is I'll take the best one that I have, and I'll train it up along the stake. And when it gets, just like training a young vine, when it gets a couple of 1.5 feet or so above the wire, you cut it off and let everything grow so that you have your spurs for the next year. The other one I grow off at an angle and catch the wire wherever I can, and then that becomes a cane for next year. So I have the head of the vine and a cane for fruit to help take up some of the excess vigor of those roots. Then the following year, if everything goes right, I cut that cane all the way off, and then at the same time I'll trim this and cut the tape off. And then I have a vine, just regular vine, that hopefully is grown enough so that I can lay 2 canes out and the head. So then the follow-up items for the grower is the next day, check for bleeding in the morning, first thing in the morning. And then a week later or 4 or 5 days later, check every single vine. And when you check, you look on top for any moisture, and then you just push here and push here. And if you see, or you'll see it bleed too. But if you see any moisture at all, you go find your cuts again and take a couple more strokes. If there's any moisture up here, you've got to cut it, because even if you don't see it, it's saturated in here, and it won't callus. In a couple weeks to a month, these will start to wake up, and then they'll start to grow, and they will push many, many shoots. Each little bud is a compound bud. It's got three buds in it. Well, all 3 of those will push. And then they'll start throwing their laterals because they've got all this vigor, all these roots behind them. So then you've got to stay on top of it for 2 things. One is to train it the way you want it trained. So if you have one long one and about 8 small ones growing out here, eventually you want to cut off all those small ones and keep your one long one for your cordon if you're going to do a cordon. The other thing you do is once they get about that high, they're susceptible to wind damage, because that'll rip out and you've lost all that work. So as soon as they get up enough, you have to tie them loosely because they're growing very vigorously. I would go through more than once a week once they really start growing. That way you won't waste any growth of the vine, and you won't lose any shoots to wind. Depending on the soil and the weather, they might need a little bit of water, but this soil and this early in the season, these won't need any water. The bane of fall budding is if you get a fall storm in. because you get moisture and cold weather, and that stops the budding process. It's not going to be good. And that's why when I spring bud, it's the same kind of thing. When I spring bud in the Santa Cruz Mountains, I wait till May. I don't do anything early. In Sonoma County, you can spring bud in March or April, but I wouldn't do it here. That's what I like about tea budding, is that if you wait to the right conditions and you follow a few simple steps, it's pretty easy to do. The conditions are the bark has to slip, the cambium layer has to be actively dividing. Then the other thing is you want to have nice healthy vines, of course. You make sure that there's no bleeding after you're budded for at least 2 weeks. And then the last one is make sure that you have everything in place so that as the vines start to grow, you catch those shoots before they fall off.